So welcome back, everybody. This is week 5 of our mindfulness group. And this week we're going to be exploring the idea and the topic of feelings and how mindfulness skills can affect or strengthen our management of our feelings and how we deal with our feelings in the moment. And I think this is relevant, as a lot of us have talked about in the past 4 weeks, of struggling with overwhelming feelings and not knowing how to deal with them in the moment. So I think this will be something that's really helpful for everyone, or at least I hope so. That's the goal. So the first thing I want us to think about this morning is to reflect on the question of, do you treat yourself as somebody who is deserving of self-care and validation for your efforts, or do you tend to neglect yourself and withdraw when you're feeling really overwhelmed or feeling overwhelming feelings? And I guess maybe going further with that question, if you are somebody who tends to withdraw and you notice that about yourself, why is it that you withdraw? What's the reason behind that? Is it because you're afraid of your feelings and because you don't want to feel that overwhelm that you tend to feel? Or is it bigger? Is it a lack of feeling that you're worthy of caring for yourself and deserving of that type of care? I think this question is a bigger one to reflect on just as we move through the rest of our hour together, and maybe even afterwards. That sense of everyone else is more important than me, or even that sense of, that we have to give ourselves away to other people, that can be really challenging. And I think that's a belief. Most of us are women in here, I believe. Let me just double check. Yeah. So I think as women, that's something that we're almost taught to constantly give and to be carers, and to especially with having kids, or if you have elderly parents, like oftentimes we're put in roles where we have to take care of others and put those people ahead of ourselves. So I think this is something that we've learned over time, and it's something that is really hard to challenge because we're not used to putting ourselves first often. So for the next hour, we're going to be diving into feelings and the topic of feelings. And to simply put it, our feelings and emotions, are signals within our body that tell us what's happening. So feelings are mental experiences or associations and reactions to an emotional signal. So when something pleasurable is happening to you, you feel good. When something distressing is happening to you, you feel bad based on your own beliefs and your experiences. So there's a difference, I guess, between the two. So in many ways, your emotions are like an instant news service. So it gives you constant updates about what you're going through, what you're experiencing, your initial reactions to what is happening around you. And these are called our primary emotions. So our primary emotions, there's 8 of them. So we have anger. So there's, under that umbrella of anger, there's fury, outrage, wrath, irritability, hostility, resentments, and even to the point of violence. There's sadness, so grief, sorrow, gloom, melancholy, despair, loneliness, depression. There's fear, so anxiety, apprehension, nervousness, dread, fright, and panic. And then we also have joy, so enjoyment, happiness, relief, bliss, delight, pride, thrill, ecstasy. We also have interest, so acceptance, friendliness, trust, kindness, affection, love, and devotion. Surprise, so we have shock, astonishment, amazement, astound, and wonder. Disgust, which could be under the umbrella of contempt and disdain, scorn, aversion, distaste, and revulsion. And then lastly, we have shame. So guilt, embarrassment, remorse, regret, those kinds of things. So these are strong feelings that come on quickly, and they don't really involve you having to think about what happened. It's kind of like your knee-jerk reaction to what's happening to you in the present moment. So for example, when you win a contest, you might feel really surprised and overwhelmed and happy. When someone you care about dies, you feel really sad and lost and just awful. When someone does something that offends you, you might immediately feel angry, right? So all of these feelings, these primary emotions, are the instantaneous reactions that we have to the things that happen around us or to us. But in addition, we don't only experience primary emotions. We also have secondary emotions. So our secondary emotions are emotional reactions to our primary emotions. So to put it another way, our secondary emotions are feelings about our feelings. So there's different types of secondary emotional reactions. The first being that you have discomfort or judgment about your primary emotion. So when you fail to validate your primary emotion as being normal or reasonable or helpful, you create a secondary emotion. So for example, if you're hurt by somebody else, you might often turn this into feeling angry. So that's that secondary emotion. And you often end up then dealing with the anger and avoiding that primary emotion of feeling hurt. So it's actually more helpful and it's easier to deal with the hurt part of it. But because of that secondary emotion of the anger, we tend to get stuck dealing with that, and then the root of the problem never gets solved. Another way secondary emotions can come up is when emotions evoke something about your perceived identity. So if you assume that an event or behavior of another person says something about you, your worthiness, your goodness, your value, or your image, then the emotion evoked from that event will be pretty intense and strong. And if you realize that this event only says something about the event or the other person and it's not about you, this can actually decrease the intensity of your reaction, but that's often really hard to do in the moment. We also can have secondary emotions where intense emotions come up from the past, right? This can involve symptoms of PTSD or trauma, right? Intense emotions are stored in our memories. So we recall emotional reactions from particular events, and these are and again, these come on as really intense emotions from trauma or adversities. And emotional memory can be triggered by present events that offer kind of a similarity or have a resonance with something that happened to you before. So if you stop avoiding, I guess, the feelings that you're experiencing in present time, or if you avoid them, your old emotions will lose their power and lower in intensity. So what we're saying here is if we're not dealing with what's happening in the present moment, and if we avoid these things like we tend to do, right? We've talked about how ways that we avoid our feelings or avoid that sense of overwhelm. Then those other emotions, those secondary emotions maybe that we're having are only increase with intensity because they're still not being dealt with. So by actually not avoiding those things, you can actually lower the intensity of those past emotions and those secondary emotions. So we can also have emotions from assumptions that we make about our worlds. So we often make assumptions about our lives and the world around us. Some are accurate, some aren't. Either way, these assumptions are increasing and decreasing the intensity of our emotional experience. So if you think that everyone has to approve of you every time they disapprove, you will experience intense emotions, right? So if we have that belief that we need to be approved of or liked by everyone that we come in contact with, then, that's going to lead to a lot of disappointment or intense emotions related to when somebody doesn't approve of us. So if we can learn, I guess, that some people will disapprove and not everyone is going to like us all the time, and we become okay with that and we accept it, your emotional state in the face of disapproval will lessen over time. And lastly, another way that our secondary emotions can show up is when we have emotions about our fear or anticipation of the future. So fear or anticipation about our future will actually intensify all of our emotional states. If you expect failure, evidence of problems will create intense emotions. So even if, for example, you're preparing for a test and you're just struggling with a concept and you're really having a hard time, that's going to bring up all of those intense feelings, and then you're going to continuously expect something bad to happen at the test, when in reality, you're just really feeling scared and nervous and worried about how the test is going to go. If you expect success, the same evidence will create emotions that are less intense or immediate. Does anyone have any questions about any of those? I kind of went through those pretty quickly, but I just wanted to pause for a sec on that. Can anyone identify with feeling those things and any of those examples that came up? Okay. So a reflective question that I would like us to think about is, again, thinking about, maybe we don't have to share that, but thinking about a time when you experienced a primary emotion or when you experienced a secondary emotion. and just be curious about that experience and maybe bring one to mind. It might be helpful if you have a certain situation in mind, and then we can go through the different questions that we have here. So these questions that I have on the screen are going to be helpful for you in terms of understanding how do I identify if I'm experiencing a primary emotion versus a secondary emotion. And so we can ask ourselves questions like, is this emotion a direct reaction to an external event? If it is, then that's a primary emotion. Is this emotion becoming more intense over time? So as we're kind of after the event has happened, we're sitting in our house like 2 hours later, and we're feeling more intense and more upset about it. That likely indicates that you're experiencing a secondary emotion. Excuse me. Do you experience the emotion more frequently than the events that prompted the emotion? So if we often, say for example, we often feel sadness or maybe anger, and we feel that more frequently than just the events that's triggered that feeling, then that's likely a secondary emotion. When the initiating event goes away or recedes, does the emotion stop or does it continue? If the emotion goes away, that's a primary emotion. If it doesn't, you're likely dealing with a secondary emotion. Does the emotion continue long after the event and interfere with our ability to be present? And does this affect new and different experiences? So if that's yes, if you answer yes to that question, that's likely a secondary emotion. Is the emotion complex, ambiguous, and difficult to understand? You often find yourself, I don't really know why I feel this way. Why is it that I'm feeling the way that I'm feeling? That's often a secondary emotion, not a primary emotion. So some of these questions, again, it's just helpful because once you can understand what you're feeling, if we can identify it as being a primary emotion, so something that was triggered by an event or a situation, or is it a secondary emotion that's actually a feeling about the feelings that we're having, then we can figure out how to deal with those things. So have you ever noticed that you often don't know what you feel? You sometimes feel like you're walking around in an emotional fog, knowing that you feel bad or feel upset, but you aren't able to really name that emotion that you're feeling. If you don't know the emotion that you're feeling, it's really hard to do anything about that emotion to help yourself to really tolerate that. So once you can put a name on it, you can actually figure out what to do about it. Or perhaps it's not about knowing what you feel, but rather your feelings make you so uncomfortable that we see them as negative and something that makes our lives worse. So some of us may come from a background where it wasn't appropriate to show our feelings. We were told to suck it up or just get over it, or only babies cry babies, that kind of thing. Perhaps that you've been told in your life that you're too much or too sensitive. And when you show your emotions, these words have been said to you, and this has created now the belief that your emotions are not acceptable, so you shouldn't allow yourself to feel them, or you're not allowed to express those things. So for whatever reason, the beliefs that we have about our feelings can really shape how we know how to cope with them or how we've learned to cope with them. So can anyone relate to the ideas on the screen of having the belief of, I can't, when you feel an emotion, I can't stand this, it's unbearable, I hate this feeling, I must stop this feeling, please take it away, I can't cope with this feeling, I'll lose control, it's weak to feel this way, I'll go crazy, this feeling will go on forever, it's bad to feel this way, it's wrong to feel this way. Can anyone relate to any of these statements or what we're just talking about? The feeling of if we do handle our feelings, or if we talk about them, that we're just going to completely break apart and shatter, and everything is just going to come spewing out of us. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, but I'm curious, Cindy, do you offer yourself that kindness in encouraging yourself to feel your feelings and cry if you need to and release that feeling? Or is that something that you just offer to your children? So some of these feelings are these emotions or thoughts that we have or beliefs that we have about our feelings makes it, again, so that it's really hard to cope with them. If we have these beliefs that our feelings are not allowed, or they're unbearable, or we're not able to cope with them, that makes them inevitably hard to cope with because we have those beliefs about them. So the more strongly you hold these kinds of beliefs about your feelings, the more likely you're going to be bothered by them and want to get rid of them. So when we can't tolerate our feelings and believe that we can't cope with them, this leads to even more discomfort. And then trying to escape or avoid dealing with them leads to unhelpful behaviors, and it could lead to risky behaviors, like we talked about in our, I think, our second group. Well, anger is one of those ones that I think we all struggle with. Anger, like I said, I think I've said this before, but anger is associated with aggression and violence. That's how we've associated it. Anger in itself is not a scary feeling. It's not something to be feared, but our behavior around anger is the scary part, or the fearful part. So if we allow ourselves to feel angry, this, again, when we allow ourselves our feelings, it actually decreases their intensity, right? If we try and avoid it, or we tell ourselves, I can't stand this, or if I feel it's bad to feel this way, right? If we have any of these beliefs around our discomfort towards feelings that are maybe on the screen here, when we have these beliefs, that makes it more intense because we're not validating our own experience, we're invalidating our experiences. And that's hurtful. That's only hurting us, right? We can be invalidated all we want by other people. And that's unfortunate that that's happened to maybe all of us. I think we might relate to moments where somebody has invalidated our feelings or made us feel wrong for having feelings. But at some point we have to decide to not do that to ourselves, and to say, you know what, it's okay that I have feelings. Every human being has feelings, whether some people want to admit it or not. We all have feelings. That's just a natural part of being a human. And they're not to be feared. They're just signals. They're just telling us what's happening in our body, and the way that it's just a form of communication in our body. And it's how we deal with them or choose to deal with them that can be tricky, or lead to maybe unhelpful behaviors. That feeling like you have to be in control, right, of your feelings. And again, I would imagine that need to be in control of your feelings comes from a belief that maybe you developed from childhood. Maybe look back at your family and the way that they dealt with anger. How did they tell you? How did they talk about anger in your family? Was it something, we don't talk about that, or we don't talk about feelings in general, we sweep it under the rug? Then yeah, of course you're going to have that belief. Of course you're going to feel like I need to control them, because you were asked to do that from day dot, right? That's how you were taught. That doesn't mean that you have to continue on with that. You can decide to relearn and choose a different way of coping, but that's up to you to make that choice at this point. Crying, yeah. Don't be a crybaby, suck it up, all those things. It's really hard to hear, especially when we're younger, right? And we don't, as adults, we do have the capacity, or that rational brain, to handle our feelings, or to be able to be more in control of our reactions. But as kids, we don't have that emotional capacity. We don't have that ability to maybe control how we're feeling all the time. So when we're asked to do that, when we're asked to control those things from a young age, it just really, it makes us internalize those things, and then that leads to other issues down the line. And again, it's not about placing blame or making anyone feel bad or feel angry towards their family. It is what it is. Our families did the absolute best they could with what they had at that time, and unfortunately or fortunately, certain things come from those. But it's just what I would imagine that if you had parents who were like that, in terms of the don't cry, crying's a sign of weakness, suck it up, those kind of things, I would imagine that that's how they were raised. So they were never taught how to deal with their emotions. So seeing yours was uncomfortable for them, and they just kind of resorted back to that automatic process of what they were taught. But again, as adults now, sitting here listening to this webinar, you have a choice to decide, okay, this is how I was taught. This is what I learned when I was younger. These are the beliefs that I have about my feelings. And maybe recognize that maybe some of these beliefs are limiting you in some way, or a barrier in being able to cope with your emotions more effectively. And you get to choose here today if you want to move forward in a new way and decide that, you know, I'm ready to tackle this and change this and relearn how to do this so I can move forward in a different way and leave that old way behind. So being in touch with our feelings helps us kind of go from being mindful to mindfulness, right? When we're able to tackle our feelings and not just be kind of overwhelmed by that tsunami or that wave of emotions all the time, when we're more intentional about being curious over our feelings and understanding them a little bit more, that's practicing that skill of mindfulness, right? That attention retraining, or that awareness, or that noticing. So when we're able to do that, we're more likely to lead our emotions in a mindfulness way rather than being mindless. So emotions actually, they're not bad. They add color to our lives, but we don't really notice them in general unless they're giving us really intense pleasure or joy, or really awful pain and sadness. So if we're able to bring awareness or mindful awareness to our emotions, we can actually learn to be better at noticing and labeling our feelings over time. And so by labeling our feelings, we can appreciate the pleasant moments and be curious and open to understanding experiences, unpleasant experiences or even neutral experiences or events that maybe don't often create like a huge emotional reaction. And we often overlook those neutral ones. But when we start to develop and label, like a labeling skill, or a mindful awareness of our emotions, we're able to start noticing more emotions that we have during the day that maybe we haven't picked up on before. So let's be technical for a second. Our emotions are electrical and chemical signals in your body that alert you to what is happening. These signals often begin with our senses. So the sense of sight, touch, sound, smell, and taste. So when these signals travel to our brain, where they're processed in our limbic system, this specializes in observing and processing emotions so that you can respond to emotional situations. So the limbic system is also connected to the rest of your body, and it tells your body what to do or how to respond in an emotional situation. So your emotions are extremely important for many reasons, and especially our survival mechanisms. If we're feeling scared, that's going to send signals to our body, and you're likely going to get those like maybe goosebumps, or just like that, your heart racing a little bit, and you're going to start to, by doing that activates our fight, flight, or freeze, and we're able to take action if needed, right? But again, as we've talked about in prior weeks, sometimes this is a faulty system, and it can lead to maybe feeling anxious or overwhelmed more often, but it's still your emotions behind it. There's still something happening that we need to attend to, if emotions are being evoked. So another important thing to remember about emotions is that we have them for a reason. They all have their purpose. They all have a job. They serve us in some way. So whenever you experience an emotion, it's there to tell you something. For example, anger often comes up to motivate us to work towards change when there's something that we don't like about a situation. Anxiety likely comes up when there's something that could be dangerous to us, so motivating us to leave the situation or protect ourselves, and so on. And again, as we've talked about, sometimes these signals are faulty, and maybe they are acting a little bit more often than we need them to, which isn't always helpful. But again, once we start being able to label it, like we talked about earlier, this can really help us in navigating those things and maybe noticing, okay, I'm feeling anxious. Is this anxiety warranted for the situation that I'm in? Or is this because of something else, and because I'm thinking about a past situation, or I'm having maybe a secondary emotion? So sometimes certain people, for whatever reason, they're just more emotionally sensitive. So this means that our emotions get triggered more often than they might need to. You might find that you get angry over something that's really small that normally wouldn't bother you, or maybe you feel really anxious in a situation where there really isn't anything threatening to it. but still you can usually see why the emotion has come up in you, even if it can seem like an overreaction. So the point is not to try to get rid of our emotions. You need them. We all need our emotions. And again, like I said, it's a very basic human response to have feelings. We all have them. Instead, we want to be able to manage them more effectively and not let them control us. Right. So I'm just looking through the chat now. It is very true that our neutral experiences often don't get identified because, again, we only notice our extremes. We only notice extreme happiness and extreme sadness, right? We don't really pick up on those maybe little nuanced ones that we have during the day or anything like that. But I think I can, and maybe you can resonate with this idea of when you are practicing those mindfulness exercises during the day, and when you're kind of picking up on those little sounds or sights or smells, or you're just really paying attention to how you're feeling. In those moments, you can pick up on different emotions that you're feeling at the time, that are exciting, or it's just pleasant to hear. I'm thinking of when I can hear the birds singing in the trees outside my window. Like, that's something neutral that, I mean, I hear that all the time. You often hear birds singing, but yet if I pay attention to it, and if I'm mindful and intentional about paying attention to that, I can feel the joy that it brings me, or the excitement, or it's just that pleasantness of being curious and open to that. Black and white thinking, definitely. I think that really does apply to how we deal with our emotions. Again, going back to, it's either one extreme or the other. So we tend to only notice if it's good or bad. When we don't go to that, or we allow for those gray feelings, maybe even if you're not feeling intense joy, does that mean that you're feeling bad? Oftentimes not. But if we think in that black and white way, then yes, of course, it's like, oh, well, I'm not feeling happy, so of course I must be feeling sad, because you only have that dichotomy of good or happy and sad, rather than kind of being open and curious to maybe all of the emotions that we might be feeling or could be feeling at any time of the day. I'm curious about that judgmental piece. So if you're feeling, yeah, I guess maybe if you could elaborate on that a little bit in terms of being judgmental, or because of your own feelings, or because of the way that other people are making you feel. I'm curious about that. So, if we're just gonna kind of move forward here. Please feel free to add some stuff in the chat when you get a chance. So as we explore a full range of emotions we experience, we can practice fostering a welcoming attitude to all of them. So even the ones that we wish would go away. So by doing this, we learn to welcome all experiences, almost like they're in a guest house, or they're staying in a hotel or something, and in the guest house or hotel of our awareness. So knowing that they'll take up residence for a temporary period of time, and they have something to teach us, but eventually they might go away or move on, right? So our emotions are temporary, and how we decide to act on them is really the piece that can become the helpful or unhelpful mode there. So there's a saying that if you name a thought or emotion, you can tame it. So turning towards a difficult emotion rather than turning away and trying to avoid it can, again, make them less intense and more manageable. That's hard to imagine as we think about it. And I guess we all have maybe examples in our mind of when that's been the opposite. But I think it's often the case where you'd be surprised at how helpful it is just to say, I'm feeling really sad right now, and then say, well, why am I feeling so sad? And by asking yourselves those questions, it really does take away that edge or that intensity of the feeling. And again, that's something that we don't often do when we feel sad. Instead of saying, oh, like, I feel really sad right now, you're like, nope, I can't feel this. I don't want to feel this. Oh, here's that sadness again. Of course I'm feeling sad, right? So we get into those beliefs come in, and we start to get critical of ourselves for feeling that way. But when in reality, if you turned towards them and were welcoming to it and said, okay, here is sadness, What is it trying to tell me? What am I sad about? And again, be curious about it. It becomes more manageable to deal with. And it, like I said, it takes that edge off. Labeling that feeling or welcoming it a little bit can help us avoid ruminating on it and kind of thinking about it over and over again and getting stuck on it. And it helps us notice what's happening in the present moment. And we become more accepting of our full range of emotions rather than, again, turning away from it and shying away from those emotions. So research has found that the simple act of naming an emotion calms the emotional center of the brain. So when we're able to say, okay, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling confused, I'm feeling happy, I'm feeling excited. When we're able to name it, it actually, it tames that emotional center that's sending signals to your body to react in a certain way. So when you can learn to ride the wave of those intense emotions by developing that language to label your emotions, and it helps you observe their intensity and maybe even lessen their intensity. So this technique on the screen here is called STOP by Goldstein, is the person who developed it. And this helps us pause throughout the day and recognize the emotions that we're experiencing. So when we learn to use STOP, and we can learn to better have mastery over our feelings. So the S is for stop. You'd stop and pause and maybe then take a breath. So the T is for taking a breath. O is for observing what you notice. So trust in what your body is trying to tell you or what your emotions are trying to tell you. And then P is for proceed with the rest of your day. So let it go. Once you notice it, once you label it, once you name it, then you're able to move forward from it because it's not control. It's almost like when you name it, it's not controlling you anymore. So this is something that maybe you can do regularly and incorporate this into your day. Oftentimes, I guess I've been using this and I didn't really know that I was in my own life, in terms of when I start to feel that icky, just like heavy, that self-critical, just like uncomfortable feeling, I tend to be like, okay, why am I feeling this way? What's coming up for me? And maybe where did it come from? What kind of thoughts am I having that is creating this icky feeling? And can I label that? So once I label it, it really does lessen the intensity of it. And it kind of is just like, and you kind of relax a little bit and release your shoulders from that kind of like tension and that icky feeling. So I'm going to challenge you all to maybe try this technique and try labeling your feelings more often over the next week or so, and just see how it feels to do that. See how you feel, and if you notice a decrease in your anxiety or a decrease in that anger by being able to label it and allow it. So allowing that feeling to come through rather than, again, avoiding it or pushing it away. Okay, so before we move on to this next one, I think that's an interesting perspective in terms of emotions, and talking about maybe our emotions can lead to judgment or lead to somebody being mean or negative. I think that's a belief that maybe we have in terms of if we're talking about how we feel, we're venting, or excuse my language, bitching, right? But in reality, we need to talk about our feelings sometimes. It's okay to do that, but I guess it's about the intention you have behind it. Is that the truth of your feelings, I guess? Are you speaking up and explaining how you feel, and being vulnerable in that moment and allowing those feelings to come up, and you're sharing those with the intention of feeling better or confiding in somebody or looking for support? Or are you using them as a way to connect through, again, that kind of judgment or being negative or that kind of thing? So I think it's really more about the intention behind it. And maybe I think we often use that joking, sarcastic kind of gossipy, negative judgment style as a way to connect with people when we feel uncomfortable with how we're feeling. So I would guess that's maybe what's happening there. I'm not sure. But I'd be curious to know what you felt like your intention was behind that stuff. And if there's a way for you to get away from that, maybe more judgment, and kind of step into more of a vulnerable state. And if you feel comfortable to do that with people. So dealing with our emotions is tricky. And especially as we're kind of we've gone through this these 5 weeks, and we've learned new skills, and we're trying to practice new things and develop a different attention and a different awareness and a different mindset towards things. It can be really challenging, and there's ups and downs associated with that. If we think about how we learned to ride a bike when we were kids, right? It probably took us a few like really unsteady attempts and a few falls before we actually were able to gain balance and actually bike, right? So with every new skill that you're developing and every new thing you're going to try, there's going to be ups and downs, and it's going to be a challenge sometimes. And even when we feel like we've mastered maybe the skill, and if we're sticking with the bike analogy, we've mastered riding the bike. If you start going over new terrain, different kind of grounds, maybe some gravel or dirt with roots and everything, there's on different surfaces, you're going to feel more unsteady or less in balance with this new skill of riding that bike, because it's a new experience. Just like with our emotions, and we feel like we may master that emotion, or master maybe feeling more in control of that. And then something new and unexpected will happen to us in our lives, and things will be thrown at us, and we might feel off balance again and feel like we're back at square one. But in reality, you're not. It just means that you're faced with a new situation, and you just have to be flexible and say, I know these skills, I know what I need to do. This is just a new situation that I'm being faced with, and it's a little bit trickier for me right now. So again, having that self-compassion that we talked about, to allow yourself to make mistakes, and for that to be okay, because that's part of the process. So different situations or times in our lives may present more challenges and require extra effort on our part and more persistence. We might, challenging our biased beliefs or expectations or negative and critical self-talk, it can be really hard sometimes, especially if maybe we're more stressed, or if something new in our life comes up, oftentimes that sends us off kilter in some way, and that can really destabilize our methods of coping and the way that we handle things. But that's okay, because it's just new, and we just have to work through it. Sometimes during these times in particular, it might be really helpful to be more intentional about having self-care, paying more attention to your positive qualities, validating your own efforts, and also experimenting with different ways of acting or behaving, right? So there's definitely ways to overcome these challenges. You just have to, again, be intentional about that, and have that mindful awareness and that mindful noticing of, okay, things are really hard for me right now. Why is that? And be curious about it. Be curious about the feelings and emotions that are coming up, and then decide, okay, well, how do I cope with that? How do I deal with it based on what I know and what I've been doing well so far? How do I cope with this new situation? And even after tons of practice, maybe you've been practicing mindfulness or even meditation for years, and then all of a sudden you go through something new, and it's just really tough to practice that. And you notice yourself being really mindless, and you're not really in the present moment, and you're just having a really hard time. You might be really self-critical. But when that happens, that's okay. That's a normal part of being a human being. You're being put into a new situation, and it's really challenging and testing your skill set and your coping mechanisms, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that they're not working. It just means you might have to put a little bit of extra effort into them, and to be okay with the fact that you might feel a little bit off balance. Developing a new skill is never a smooth process, and like I said, you're always going to be faced with new challenges and different situations to apply these skills. And sometimes I think what happens is we get really down on ourselves, and we feel like we're back at square one, like, oh, I was doing so well with dealing with my anger, and then a new situation comes up and you feel really angry, and then it feels like all the work that you put in is kind of moot and it doesn't matter. But it does matter, right? Because now you're able to tackle this new situation with all these skills under your belt. So it might feel like a setback, but in reality, you're just entering a new phase and a new situation that's being asked to use those skills maybe in a different way, or maybe you have to use them more, whatever the case may be. So it can be really helpful to remind ourselves that we're human and we have bad days just like everyone. And sometimes little life challenges and hassles and chores are going to be harder to deal with, because that's just part of our journey. Not every day is going to be amazing and great. And this is just part of learning. And if we can, again, be curious about about our emotions and start labeling them and noticing them, then we can start to learn from these things and understand ourselves on a deeper level. And that can make us more likely to handle situations that are unexpected and new in a different way, and help us avoid maybe problems that we had in the past, and help us avoid them in the future. So just as I know we're wrapping up a little bit early today, but I'm welcoming some discussion for us today about what we learned and what we talked about. But I guess I just wanted to finish off with a reminder that you're doing the absolute best you can. We're all doing the best that we can right now. And you should be really proud of yourself for the accomplishments that you've had so far in relation to developing mindfulness skills and maybe practicing those in your own time. So just give yourself like a little pat on the back today, just as we wrap up and as we finish off. Be proud of yourself for coming every week. If you've been here for the past 5 weeks, that's an accomplishment, and just be proud of yourself. And again, be open to knowing that you're not going to be amazing at these things every single day, but that you're still learning, and this is a process, and that's okay. To name the emotion. Yeah. And again, I think it's such a simple thing, right? And I think sometimes we think that we might be naming the emotion, and we're actually not. We're trying to avoid it. But it's such a simple task to just say, okay, well, what am I feeling? And really name that. In your workbook this week, there's an emotion wheel. So it really goes through a lot of the different emotions. It names all of those. And it's really helpful, again, for us to develop more of a literacy on our emotions and to understand them a little bit more. So again, we can become better at pinpointing what exactly it is that we're feeling. So that could be helpful for you to go over, and just if you're looking to increase your awareness on naming your emotion. Does anyone else have anything? Practice stop. Great. And again, this is a skill. It doesn't, as we kind of have talked about before, the skills themselves and the actual techniques are pretty simple, right? But it's just about that idea of actually using them and taking the time in our day to use them. So I think that'll be, I hope it helps, and I'm looking forward to hearing if it works for you to use stop. Yeah, I think most of us can relate to the idea of using secondary emotions, or dealing, with secondary emotions rather than our primary emotions. And that's why I think that's where we get stuck, is that we're actually having a secondary emotion, but we're dealing with the primary emotion. So if we feel angry, but underneath that, we're actually really hurt, the anger is what we get stuck on, and we don't deal with the actual hurt, when in reality, that's what we need to deal with. Have you guys heard of the concept of primary and secondary emotions before? Is that kind of a new topic for everyone? Right. And I think we can all relate to that idea of when we've felt something, it's been really intense, but there's something underneath it, and we just know that maybe that's not the actual feeling that we're having. So again, I think it's great that we're able to start recognizing that. And again, that takes that power away. And as soon as we recognize it, we're able to deal with it in a better way. That's a good question. I think it would still, let me just go back a little bit here. So if we look through this list of questions here, it says, I think many of these questions, like, is the emotion becoming more intense over time, right? So even if you were trying to avoid it in that moment, it was likely that you're dealing with a crisis, and then you're putting those emotions away, you're avoiding them, but they're still becoming more intense over time, and they're still coming up. So that would likely be a secondary emotion. Even if, like you said, you had to block them to get through it. And I think we also touched on in the beginning about secondary emotions, in saying that especially when they're related to a trauma, they are likely, let me just see. Yeah, so if they're related to a trauma or a really emotional event, that's a secondary emotion, right? Because it's that crisis is likely because of a buildup or because of something that's happened to you in the past, right? So that would be a secondary emotion. And again, it's not about getting rid of the PTS emotions. It's more about learning how to manage them better, I guess. again, I think it goes back to, again, labeling those feelings and not shying away from the fact that you're having them, right? We talked a lot about naming the feeling and allowing them, welcoming them, I guess. When with PTSD in particular and trauma, the typical coping mechanism for that is to avoid or to numb, right? Because they're so overwhelming, it's really hard to deal with, which makes total sense. And I understand why you would numb and why you would avoid. But maybe through therapy and through being with a trusted person that knows how to kind of guide you through that process, it's about going there, I guess, and welcoming those emotions and really, really tapping into them, naming them and talking about them and processing through them. That's not something that I would recommend doing on your own time if you're just by yourself, if you don't feel like you're able to do that. But yeah, I think oftentimes when we're coping with PTSD, it's difficult because we avoid and we numb, and it's so overwhelming and difficult to deal with. But when we learn to go there and to tell our story and to not block those things out and to welcome them into our consciousness, it helps us deal with them, it helps us process through it, and it helps decrease their intensity over time. I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but if anyone is struggling in particular with emotions or just bigger things like trauma or PTSD, and you need extra support and you don't have that, Breelove is offering a counseling clinic. So it's a free 45-minute session, and you can, access that through contacting CMHA of New Brunswick. And so if you're interested in pursuing something more, and you have things that maybe you're struggling with that are bigger than just mindfulness and maybe coping skills, it would be helpful for you to maybe explore that option. And through the counseling clinic, if further therapy is necessary, we can arrange that or connect you with the resources and referrals that need to be made. So if anyone's feeling like they might need an extra support around that, especially right now or just in general, know that there's options for you. Yeah, so if anyone's interested, they just posted in the chat the email that you send if you'd like to get involved in the clinic and get that free 45-minute session. Thank you so much. All right. So again, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to shoot them off. I can be available for the next 7 minutes. But otherwise, if you're feeling done for the day, you can head out as well. Thank you. And I hope everyone comes back for week 6.